I would like to first talk about cross-linguistic studies, then a little bit about what is corpora based on, and finally some questions about oral versus written language in each one of these languages that we have covered. So in terms of cross-linguistic studies, as I briefly mentioned earlier, having this kind of information will help us to develop better cross-linguistic studies that can then tell us something new and important about reading development. My own foray into cross-linguistic studies started with the skepticism of how well the theories and models of reading development that were developed within English language translated to my own language, which is Finnish. At the moment, most cross-linguistic studies include English as one of the languages. In multiple ways, English is an outlier orthography. And I don't mean just in terms of inconsistency of grapheme phoneme correspondences. For example, we learned today that word length in Filipino, Kannada, and also Malay is quite a bit longer than what is typical of English. And we also learned that the morphological structure of Filipino and Kannada is quite a bit more complex than what it is in English. This must have some real ramifications into how we learn to recognize words and how we parse words into different kinds of graphemic units. We also learned that English uses high proportion of base words and is morphologically relatively poor if you contrast this with Filipino's rich use of prefixes or Kannada's rich use of suffixes. It is clear that you can ask different kinds of experimental questions if you understand the linguistic features of Kannada and Filipino. For example, do frequent prefixes affect root recognition differently than frequent suffixes? Dr. Dawson just showed us an interesting slide on how suffix frequencies influence lexical decision performance. I would expect that in both Filipino and in Kannada, those numbers would be quite different, and we would also examine prefix, and we could also examine prefix versus suffix effects, which we can't really do in English very effectively. When information of this kind we have been provided today accumulates across languages, we will be able to leave English out as an outlier orthography and compare orthographies that differ in features we could not examine in English, while still being able to control for confounding language features. And that, I think, is extremely important, that we do have this information so that we can control for confounding features without having information on morpheme frequencies, for example, or neighborhood frequencies, things like that. We cannot control for many confounding features that can then affect our experiments. And I think this will be, having this information available on more and more languages will be hugely important for theory development, because it allows us to select better the languages that we will contrast. My second issue here is that what kinds of materials should the corpora be based on? Optimally, we would like to reach what was presented for English, where the words were collected from different kinds of books. And we would hope to get there so that we can also choose different pools of source materials depending on the questions we ask. When we were developing our limited Sinhala corpora, we decided to focus on textbooks alone that all children read, as it was clear that including children's fiction would have also introduced significant differences in access to that fiction. In other words, it would have further accentuated the SES effects that typically are present in this kind of a data. I further suspect that those SES differences would interact with reading skills in a manner we don't yet fully understand. What we learned from Dr. John's presentation is that books for 9 to 10-year-old children are still, for the most part, quite short. At this age, many advanced and privileged readers in Western countries, at least, move to longer fantasy novels, such as the Harry Potter or the Aragon series, that are so popular, or at least they were popular when my kids were younger, that the parents have to buy the books because libraries have way too long waiting lists for them. Compared to someone who reads the books that may be available in the classroom for their age, the difference in print exposure must be 100-fold in favor of a child who can read longer novels and whose parents can afford to buy them. The final comment about what goes into corpora is that we don't really know yet how electronic media is changing the reading habits or the text children have access to. For example, instead of reading the fiction or in addition to it, a Harry Potter fan can also read a never-ending supply of fan fiction that is unlikely to be as rich in vocabulary and grammatical structures, etc., than the original. On the other end of interest scale, a child may only read sports results on their phone, or perhaps short summaries of games with very limited vocabulary that may not transfer well to educational context. I am not sure yet if this is yet an issue in India or Philippines, but at least the Australian teachers are now reporting that children read much fewer books than they used to and spend much more time on social messaging. At some point, we need proper longitudinal studies to establish what the impact of electronic media is on print exposure and what kind of exposure it promotes or hinders. My own experience with this was that a couple of years ago, we were trying to develop a print exposure measure for Danish university students. And the feedback we got from the students is that the old-fashioned measures that look at, do they know author names or do they know titles of books or anything like that, were relatively useless and did not end up predicting anything. And we had to give up because we couldn't really figure out that what is the print exposure that these individuals had been exposed to. The final discussion point I have is about oral language and the possible differences between oral and written language. I noticed that in the question answer forum, there were also quite a few questions about diglossia. And I think diglossia is the extreme end here, where written language is can be very different from oral language. If the orthography is consistent, we would expect that this difference can lead to, if the orthography is inconsistent, the difference should lead to both reading and writing problems. But in consistent orthographies, it could lead to only writing problems, as I believe is the case with Sinhala and in Arabic in some countries. I don't know that anyone has looked at the morphology and diglossia, but there may be some smaller differences that may well affect literacy development. Let me take an example from a language with a very complex morphology, Finnish. In written Finnish, it is not uncommon to see multiple different suffixes added to the end of a noun. There are 15 different noun cases, for example, in Finnish, and they can be compounded. So you can have 5 of them, one after another. For example, you can write in one word, also not in our shops, where you have the root, then the negative, plural, abscessive, and possessive suffixes all added at the end of the root word. All Finns who have finished primary school will be able to read and understand that, because all those suffixes are common by themselves. However, no one would ever use that word in oral language because it would be too difficult to parse without seeing it. Instead, they would use 4 separate words to achieve the same message. If the distance between what the child hears and what they are asked to read is substantial, how will that affect reading fluency and subsequently comprehension? And this is one issue that I have for the participants, that you now have collected a significant amount of information about morphological complexity in the written language. But how much of that information is also available in the oral language? To examine questions of that kind, we need not only a print corpora, but we also need the speech corpora to understand the difference between the language the children know and the language we want them to learn. I noticed in the Canada presentation that out of about 100,000 words, 30,000 were unique instances, new words when children see them. That means that roughly every 3rd word that the child sees, they have not seen before in print. That is a staggering number of new words to read, and it would be very important to know whether those words are familiar to them orally, or whether they are forms that they haven't even heard before, but now are reading. In essence, a child with a poor vocabulary would then have to decode a non-word in a sentence of 8 words, they would have to decode 2 non-words and try to figure them out. That must have serious consequences for reading comprehension. The final point, which is not so much a discussion point, but just a note that when I was reading through the presentations, I noticed that while a lot of them a lot of the presentation discussed the relationship between morphology and reading, the models that exist were lacking. So I would like to point out that there are some good theoretical models on how morphology and reading could be connected. One is Kirby's and Powers's morphology as a binding agent model. And they see morphology as connecting semantic, phonological, and orthographic information of words. So they they see it impacting quality of words, lexical representations, and through that reading. The other model that you may want to look at is Befredi's reading systems framework, where morphology contributes both directly to reading contribution, but also then to word identification, indirectly to reading comprehension via word identification. So I think that as you collect more information about morphology and you want to tie it to reading, it is important that you design your experiments so that they perhaps contrast some aspects of these models, both developed within the English language and start challenge these models and make them more applicable to your own situations and your own languages.
So in terms of model building, there is the approach where you take a model that's been developed in one language and you try and see whether it needs to be expanded to accommodate another language type. But there's the other approach of being grounded and work from the language up to see what the model might look like. How has it been done for Finnish? Because Finnish clearly has a very strong multimorphemic character to it.
Yeah, and that you kind of caught me on a weak point there. It's not done in Finnish. The Finns do never ever take an English model and try to retrofit into the language, because, for example, things like lexicality effect makes no sense in Finnish. You'll almost never see the same word written again in the same way. So you don't really develop anything like side vocabulary or anything like that. Very limited side vocabulary. So typically the Finnish build their own models, but they don't actually, they tend to be relatively limited. The problem that rises there is the communication issue. So most of the people presenting today are young. They want to, they do want to publish and they want to make a career. And the communication gets a little easier if you start with a model that people know, and you then start to take it apart. And then you end up with 5 papers later, you end up with a unique model. So I think that that's one problem why we are still so Anglo-centric, is that the models that have been developed, for example, in Chinese, people can't connect them to what they know. So I think it's important to start from what the audience that you want to influence understands, and then shake them up a little bit. But the Finnish work in terms of theoretical model building has not really been very influential. It's been very influential in terms of producing data on multiple different processes, but not so much on influencing theories.
Thank you. Thank you, because a lot of the points that you've brought in are relevant, of course, to a young project like Talk Together, but also others in the room who may be interested to look at understudied languages. And of course, those amongst us who are looking at, well-studied languages, but through a new lens.